All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ria. I will be recording and moderating today's session. Again, thank you so much for joining in and being here. A lot of you all are very familiar faces who have been visiting and being a part of this lecture series since August when we started it, and that's a very nice thing to see. Uh, like I said, these lectures have been we're conducting this lecture since August, and we've gotten participation from a lot of diverse groups and teachers, educators, practitioners, researchers, a lot of PhD students, a lot of lecturers have joined, which is really great. Along with Nerman lectures from January last month, we also started something called Nerman Workshop. So these are paid workshops. They're more practitioner friendly, practice oriented. So the language is quite simpler. It's not much more theory oriented, much more practice based. And this month's lecture is going to be on preschool education. So do keep a lookout in your inbox. It will happen sometime at the end of this month. And yeah, so a little bit about today's lecture and the series. We've been conducting the Politics of Childhood lecture series since December, and we've conducted a lot of different topics within influences of childhood and how childhood gets influenced through history of India, various religions, how it gets influenced through gender, and which is today's lecture. Professor Nita Kumar will talk about how the experiences of one's childhood are influenced by socialization processes of one's assigned sex, and how the nuances of sex and gender affect one's access to education and their respective schooling experiences based on feminine and masculine traits and roles that are ascribed to the particular child. So before we begin with today's lecture, a quick introduction about Nirman, about today's speaker. Nirman is a not-for-profit organization. We are based out of Varanasi city, and we work in 12 adjoining villages in Banaras. Nirman started in 1990, so we've been working in the fields of education, art, music, research for about 30 years now. We run an innovative school called Vidyashram, the South Point School. We have two campuses, one in the city, one in the Betawar village. It's an integrated, inclusive school. That means children from various walks of life, various backgrounds are part of our classroom. So that means that students from families of farmers, weavers, daily wage workers, uh, entrepreneurs, researchers, teachers, they're all part of our school. We also run a research wing called the Center of Post-Colonial Education. So we host study abroad students from universities around the world and invite them to collaborate with our teacher at Nerman and our students at Nerman as well. This lecture series has been kind of like an online shift of the research wing. We also have an artist studio, and we collaborate with various artists from music, visual arts, theater. So generally, when schools used to be work functioning, our school calendars used to be filled with these projects throughout the year, and I'm sure we all dearly miss it. A little bit about our speaker today. She's known to me and most of us over here as Nita ma'am, but she's also known to people as Professor Kumar. She completed her PhD from University of Chicago. Her fields of research have been in history of modern India, anthropology, as well as Russian and European history. She takes university courses about South Asian history, gender, Bollywood. She's taught in various universities like University of Chicago, Brown University, University of Michigan. Also written multiple books, research papers. So I'm sure if you just search her, you'll find details about all of those things. She's the founder and director at NIRMAN. So over the last 30 years, she's taught and written curricula, trained teachers, worked on children's art projects as well as children's books. Uh, she's also developed curriculum. She's also trained not just teachers at Nirman, but teachers from various different colleges abroad as well as Indian. And yeah, before I take more of your time, I would now like to invite Nita ma'am to introduce today's lecture and start it. Just a quick note from my end. Our aim with this lecture was to further the dialogue in education and its various connections and interlinkages. So So we will be having a question answer round in the end. Feel free to drop your questions, comments, experiences, anything that you resonate with also in the chat box at any time during the lecture in any language that you're comfortable in.
Thanks, Ria. Welcome to everyone who is here. I wish, as all of us probably do, that it could be even more interactive than we can possibly make it. I would love to know what you all are interested in. So please do jot down questions, comments, and so on as I'm talking, and I will make sure to leave time at the end to follow up on some of those things. Because what's the use of just a unilateral discussion of such a very, very important topic? So the first thing I want to begin by stressing is how crucial it is to try to come to the bottom of how it is that education works, specifically on children, to produce people that we call girls and then that we label women. So how is girlhood, womanhood, femininity produced? And what is the role particularly of education in this process? That's the topic. And I bet you already share with me a tremendous interest in it. So I don't need to persuade you of that. I'll cut through all that and assume that we are all feminists, by which I mean that we are really interested in understanding and comprehending the inequality of the sexes in order to do something about it. And we are also to some extent interested in education, which is why we are looking through the lens of schooling in order to understand this. So the first point is actually about education. In order particularly to understand gender and the situation of girls, we must broaden our understanding first of education itself. Now, we are all used to associating it with schools, which is all fine and good. But in fact, there are many sites of education. And most of all, the sites that are important are the family, the larger community, the discourses prevalent in society, which are filtered to the individual through the community and the family. And these discourses include the discourse of femininity and masculinity. Both are important. We're talking about gender and not just about women. And there is a bit of what is called psychology, in that the results are then experienced internally by the individual in terms of values, in terms of expectations placed on them, and so on. So what I'm trying to say is that in order to understand what our topic is, how education produces femininity and produces girls and women, we have to first accept that there are many sites in which this is going on. In fact, formal schooling is perhaps one of the weaker sites, to the extent that, taking the case of India, for instance, we have, in principle, no distinction made in the curricula between girls and boys. That means everyone is taught the same content at different levels in different classes. There is no distinction made, as used to be done a century or so ago, in the subjects, such as needlework for girls and housework and domestic science and so on. Yes, in college and in at higher educational levels, girls do opt more for certain kinds of subjects. And since I mentioned home science or domestic science, let me again mention that, and sitar and Sanskrit and dance and so on. All our mothers did that, for instance. But in school, those subjects are not available. And they are the same. And girls are, of course, to be found in smaller numbers when there is a choice in science and arts, for instance. However, the availability is the same. And there is no particular direct pressure on girls to study a different kind of curriculum. Whether it's for good reasons or bad, some of the reasons are not very good, actually. You might just want a larger body of trained citizens. You just might need some kind of a workforce. You might actually believe that an educated mother is the best kind of mother, and therefore you promote that. You might think that it will lead to overall economic prosperity. In other words, these are seemingly good values, but they are not values that put the individual at the forefront. So they're not in the interest of the individual, they're in the interest of some other body like the nation or, society or your religious group or whatever. So some of these groups, for instance, might strike us immediately when we look at their work as being very pro-women and very egalitarian in their approach to gender. It's actually not that. They're using women as a symbol or a tool of some kind, as a sign of their progressiveness, of their strength, of their authenticity, etc. But for all these reasons, as I said, good or bad, the fact is that access to the same education is open to both girls and boys, right? To both males and females. The main educational philosophies, and of those, which is a huge number of philosophies that exist in the world, the ones that concern us are the progressive ones, the constructivist ones, as they are called. So the main philosophers within this realm, such as John Dewey, Jean Piaget, Leo Vygotsky, all of these are also not divided in what they propose according to gender. So these philosophies, especially the progressive constructivist ones, are devoid of gender differentiation. So we are on somewhat safe ground if we say that both today's educational philosophies and today's educational systems are not themselves pernicious to the interest of girls. We have to look beyond that to see where does lie this kind of inequality which already constrains certain human beings into girlhood or womanhood. So here's where I come to one of my favorite topics, which is called the hidden curriculum, right? The hidden curriculum. And that's what I say we have to worry about. It can also be called social reproduction, and in this case, gender reproduction. But I think the technical term hidden curriculum does it more justice, and which is what's going to make most sense once we start deconstructing it. So the term itself was first used mostly to understand class difference, and it was articulated first by Bowles and Gintis in an old 1970s study called Schooling in Capitalist America. And as the title might suggest to you, it was trying to explain how differentiation by social class and the location of an individual in a different class, right? It's a Marxist study. So according to the relations of production, is produced by the school. Because what the school is doing is actually trying to reproduce society, and that it's a pillar of society. It's an instrument of society and of social hierarchy. And it does that by very interesting and actually subtle kinds of procedures, which is why it's called hidden. It's hidden from everyone but the practitioners, and to some extent from them themselves, because they just do it as a role that they play. So just as an example, students from more advantaged classes, the elite students, are taught intellectual open-mindedness and problem solving and critical thinking and flexibility, such skills and dispositions which would enable them then to function as high-level professionals, such as managers and so on. And children of the working classes and of minorities are taught basic things such as punctuality, neatness, respect for authority, and a control of behavior by external means, right? And they're taught tolerance for boredom, for just mechanical procedures in their classroom sites. This kind of difference is guaranteed to reproduce the kinds of classes that it addresses. Now, let's try to, and by the way, there's a lot of research on the hidden curriculum which shows how seemingly small and innocent processes in the schools and classrooms go towards reproducing social inequality. If we apply this idea to gender, then we can see how girls' socialization and how the differential treatment of girls in co-educational schools. We can talk separately about specifically girls' schools, because they are different to some extent, only to some extent, but they are. So in these co-educational schools where there are girls and boys, there is an ongoing, completely seamless, um, continuous kind of process of socialization by which, through very tiny and subtle means, girls are always taught who they are and what it means to be a girl. So very simply speaking, girl socialization in any average school would include an assumption that they cannot carry and lift heavy objects. A boy is always called for that they cannot be leaders, decisive leaders, strong leaders, right, and play certain kinds of leadership roles. When it's time for sports or gymnastics, there's a differentiation and they don't get to play the same hard and challenging games as do the boys. There are exceptions, but this is overall in pattern. And to some extent, I also want to mention, this is consolidated by the treatment that is expected in the staff, both teaching and non-teaching staff. They too are differentiated in this way, so they can't also lift or carry or do challenging physical tasks, or go, even for the staff to go to the market or to do certain kinds of, you know, strength needing cleaning jobs. So let me show you an image to move on to a better discussion of the hidden curriculum. And here I'm going to show you two little girls, 3-year-olds, who are playing. So they are two girls who are playing at a tree trunk. And as you'll see, there's a little platform in front of the tree on which they can elaborate their playing. But they are playing a game called, they were asked by me. I was pleasantly surprised that they didn't get very disturbed by me. I sat on one side and I asked them casually, what are you playing? The name of the game, as they told me, is Bachchi Mama, which means, as we all know, mother and child. And the child is sick, so now the mother has become a doctor and arrived there. And what you see in this screen is the production of the medicine by the doctor in green and the happy but sick child on the right. Just to give you a different perspective on it, they don't have any toys, they don't have any resources. They're playing with what's lying on the ground. So there's some dust, there's some stones, and they have some kind of a lid of a bottle, which they are using to do their little playing. Since the photographs are jumping around, I'm going to jump further and tell you the larger scene. So here's the brother of one of them. He is sitting there playing his own thing. He's not interested in their game. And what he is doing is playing marbles, but homemade ones. He doesn't actually have marbles. He has little bits of stone of different sizes. And he's playing by himself, a very elaborate process of making a circle, hitting one, then letting it bounce, then going to wherever it bounces. So one could be full of admiration for him. He is older, but he's absorbed in his game, and they're equally absorbed in theirs. So let's get back. Let's stop sharing this. I think you've seen how cute they are, right? this one, which was there at the end, if you saw it, when they saw that I was taking pictures, they turned to me with the flattest stones they had, and they said, we are taking your picture, and they ended like that. So the game was undisturbed right to the end. Now, this is how it works. They have tremendous imagination, all three children. Both these girls, however, are solidly girls already. They are identifying with their mothers. They're playing a role, they're playing a game with roles which put them in nursing, caring situations, mothering, parenting kinds of situations. They're very happy. They think it's the best kind of game to play, just like the boy thinks what he's doing is the best kind of game to play. But of course, it could worry the researcher, it could worry the observer. And I worry as their teacher and friend, and I'm the grandmother of one of them also. So I worry on many counts as to why in an emancipated school like mine and a very emancipated family like mine, at this very raw age of 3, there is already the production of gender. And where is it coming from? Where is this socialization residing? Where is it sited? And how should we think about it or do anything about it? So both, of course, are girls who receive most of their parenting from their mothers. Their fathers are involved. In the case of one, I hear that he's involved. In the case of the other, I see that he is involved. They help at every level of their lives, including to dress them, to feed them, to tell stories to them, to play with them. But, I, for one, have not made a minute study of a minute-by-minute interaction. And arguably, that parents' interaction is different for a girl, as other research has shown, than it would be for a boy. The girls are not girlish in that they can scream their lungs out, they jump all over the place, they tumble over mud and bricks and love to hit and catch balls and climb and slide and everything else. And as you saw, they were dressed in soft, comfortable clothes, jeans and sweatshirts and nice shoes. They were not girlish in any way. So the only thing that distinguishes girls from boys at that age is actually the game, the way that their fantasy is moving and the way that they are getting pleasure out of a reproduction of the adult world into their little childish world. How should we think about it? What can we possibly do about it? So our reaction to this gendered game could be the following. One, we could interfere and say, let's play Bachchi Papa instead. So break this syndrome of Bachchi Mama, the mother as being the primary parent, and make them think much more of the fact that the father could be the parent. And that happens in many families, so it's not so far-fetched as all that. It would need an effort on the part of the adult because it hasn't been initiated by the child as the rest of the game has. Secondly, we could say, how about playing some ball instead, or playing marbles like this boy is doing, or even flying kites, or whatever it is that we are able to do. It's not that adults are able to do a whole lot, and they do take recourse to the easiest. In this case, the easiest by far for the several adults around this space was to let them do whatever they were doing. That was by far the easiest. Even if we brought out blocks, which is the second easiest, blocks have the risk of also verging on domesticity. You tend to make houses and things like that with them. So that's not such a great option either. We could simply ignore them and their name for it and cut it short by interfering and just starting another game. Not discuss anything, not talk about anything, just play a different game, like with a ball or a bat or whatever. So by giving all these options, I'm not saying that it's a multiple choice kind of exercise with one correct answer, or maybe the correct answer is all of the above or any of the above. I'm trying to place before you the problem in all its dimensions that we should be aware of. It's not easy to be the school which has to deal with children who are already coming somewhat formed and produced by their domestic sites, and then to continuously carry this on because their socialization at home is going to also continue through the years, just as your interaction in schools will do if you're a teacher. I also want to point out that this overpowering shadow of gender socialization, which resides in every niche of society, is so all-encompassing that it's really a huge challenge that needs all our intelligence and sensitivity and creativity to fight it. Here are the problems. Let me summarize them as 1, 2, 3, 4. So the first problem number 1, is that girls actually do not evaluate themselves as highly as boys. I'm reading a very lovely book right now called The Evolution of Calpurnia Tate. Calpurnia being an old Roman name, I think Caesar's wife or something like that. It was an award winner, The Evolution of Calpurnia Tate. It's not exceptional in its story because the story is a common one. The girl in the story wants to be a scientist, but she belongs to a family where she is expected, as she turns 12, to start learning cooking and needlework and knitting. And every time that she's trying to go out to do a little bit of observation and experimentation, which she likes to do just in her backyard and extended yard, she is called back by her mother, who wants her to sit down and learn one of these girl proud skills. So Calpurnia actually, in the beginning, keeps thinking, why couldn't I be a boy? Why do I have to be stuck in this girlish form? But as time proceeds, she gets more and more habituated to it. She just thinks, well, if that's the way it is, I mean, how is one supposed to think differently? If that's what your role is, and you're being, it's being again and again and again affirmed by everyone who surrounds you, everyone you care for. Calpurnia, for instance, has a big hero in her grandfather, who is actually a scientist, who has met Charles Darwin and, you know, very big things like that. This story is set in the past. And she adores him and wants to be like him. But when it comes to the crunch, he doesn't support her either. He thinks that the mother knows best. And if she wants to teach her knitting and cooking, that's the direction in which the girl's life should go. Now, many of us, I think, in growing up, may have also wanted to be boys. Girls find it very easy to be envious of boys. Think of all the freedom that boys have. Think of all the opportunities they have. Think of all the subjecthood they are given, right? They're supposed to be the ones who control their own lives and all the actions within it. And they're given things, they are maybe loved, they are given lavished affection, they're given a lot of admiration, but that's all not the subject's position, but the object's position. Now, among themselves, in a group of girls only, girls of course know they are good enough. Every individual girl might know privately somewhere inside that she is as good as any boy that she knows. But in mixed society, and all society is mixed, and in the time of living with everyone and interacting with everyone, right? They know that they are unsure. They know that there is more than that. They are both as good as, but not really actually equal to boys. And they have to accept it. So in order to be who they are, in order to receive due recognition, they have to put on a performance of sometimes being inferior or being fine with their restrictions, of having to play certain roles. This is a very big problem that one has to take into account whenever we are dealing with boys and girls, that the girls are already in their mind convinced that they are second to the boys. Now, one could use many tactics. One should particularly be ironical and humorous about this, but at one level, always be serious about the qualities of girls, about the fact that children are children, and beyond being girls and boys, they all share across the board the same qualities. For those who lack self-esteem more than some others do, one has to work very hard to compensate that by stressing those very qualities that make them equal, not by stressing the qualities that are admired for being feminine and outside the school in other kinds of situations which produce affection and admiration for them. So these are tricky things to work out, but if one has to be successful in this, they have to be worked out. Problem number 2, the silencing of girls and the silencing of women. So women have actually achieved more in history than is acknowledged. I said the same thing about Dalits yesterday, and I promised to mention it again about women. The fact that they are not represented in archives and therefore written about as much in formal histories and in formal academic disciplines is only a function of the gendered nature of academia and research scholarship. It's not a function of the actual lives of people in history. Now, again, many of us might have experienced this, but when I grew up without any role model of a single woman scientist or artist or political leader or philosopher or any of those kinds of things I admired. I mean, there was no way that there was going to be a woman Shakespeare or a great woman poet. Almost all the poets I read were men, and there were women poets who crept in into that canon, but they were frankly not the most rank. They were just beyond that. And many of us try to be neutral and think of ourselves as human beings, and therefore it doesn't matter whether it's a man or woman whom we admire in any of these areas of life. That's fine, but then at a certain point, someone is sure to point it out in a very blunt way that you are a woman, and therefore you don't share this world which has been created and constructed and beautified by men. Now, what I'm saying is that that is a condition of many of our childhoods and our growing up experiences. But there is a lot of scholarship that's emerging and wonderful things are being produced. And I just want to mention one 2-volume work by Tharu, Lalita and Susie Tharu and K. Lalita and Tharu, called Women Writing in India, where they've done a tremendous job going back to Buddhist times and coming up to the present of finding out in all the languages of India, all the linguistic areas of India, who were the women who wrote anything at all, in poetry or prose, short story or plays or novels. And if you haven't seen this and you're interested in women in India, please do. Women Writing in India is the title, in 2 volumes. And it reveals hundreds of poets and authors that none of us knew existed. And that's what I mean by the fact that there is a vast number of active, powerful, live women in our history who have to be discovered and researched and written about and shared. The job of a patriarchal society, you might say, is actually to erase the evidence of women's lives and power. In an article I've written called Oranges for the Girls, or the half-known history of education in Banaras, meaning Banaras city, I've studied a school called the Agarwal Samaj School. It's only a case study, mind you. It's not that this school is peculiar. All the schools for girls are like that. But this was a girls' school. And what I found when researching it was that all the credit throughout its history was given to men. The women were erased from the record. So I, in this article, have tried to make up for that by somehow pursuing I could find. If I found the mention of a woman's name, I tried to find out who was this woman. The principals were women, the teachers were women, the girls, it was a girls' school, their mothers and the girls and the ayahs and everyone around, the active people were all women. But the managing committee consisted of men, right? The donor for the school was a man, and so on. And they hogged all the credit for the whole thing. So this is, as I try to discuss it, very common phenomenon. And it can happen for one little school. It can happen for the whole history of a country. It can happen for the whole history of the world. We might actually believe that men have been the doers and actors. And that's one of the disservice we pay our students when we fail to represent to them the fact that there are actually a whole missing group of people. They're not actually missing in action. They're missing in our representation of them in our various forums. Problem number 3, the roles that women have played are multiple, and we ignore many of them while we try to stress 1 or 2 of them. Let me name a few quickly. So, of course, they are as wives and housewives, and as mothers and sisters and daughters, the supporters of men who are the active ones in public life. So since the world is divided into private and public gets all the credit for being the active agent-like part of society, the women who make this possible, who are confined to inside the homes, to the kitchen mostly, but other parts of the home also, there's not adequate theorization of what that means. To the extent that if you were to ask a classroom to go around and say, what does your father do? Everyone would have an answer. Then you ask, what does your mother do? And many of them might say nothing. And then that would be an opportunity to point out that that's a completely wrong answer. It's just that there's no title for that work. Housework is not, something anyone thinks of very seriously as being an occupation. But if you were to be able to explain it in some way, as sometimes is done in some kinds of feminist histories, that if it wasn't for someone taking care of all that housework, the man would simply not be in a position to ever go out and do any of the things that he was doing. So right here, you have a very important teaching moment to explain about the role of women in society. But the other one is, of course, their sharing, both as some kind of informal helpmeets, which often they do, but actually the professional work. So my story would always, of course, be about artisans. And I spent such long and very interesting years studying the artisans of Banaras, only to come up with a monograph which was totally about the men artisans. And when I got a little bit wiser and my consciousness was raised, then I went back and tried to find where the women were in these same communities. And I was very embarrassed to realize that all the work that I had given credit to men for was being, to a large extent, also being done by women. It was just that they were kept behind the front room or the weaving room where the men were working. So yeah, the women were in parda for the most part in the case of Muslims, but in the case of the many Hindu communities also, they were behind the front room. So the spaces were designed such, the talk was such. If I asked about the work, men would take all the credit for it. Honestly, they never once said, our women also contribute to the work. And they did, but only when I looked specifically for women. So this kind of sharing of work is often erased from any kind of research and therefore presentation. Some scholars have done a very, very interesting study of a kind of woman who's called the Virangana. Virangana means martial women, women who play a public role, women who are like men, except that they are celebrated for being such warrior women and such powerful women. So we know the case of all those. They are exceptions, but it's nice to have that kind of a role model. You could always use that when teaching gender or when bringing home to a mixed class of girls and boys, how the same thing can be done by women. So what if it can only be done by a handful of women? As long as they can do it, that shows that any of their caste, any of their sex could do it. Here is my own contribution to this whole research. I have worked a lot on the history of education, and in doing that, I've written a lot about the leaders of India, social and of course political leaders, the group that I've called the intelligentsia. They all had a good education, and they all took they all played very strong leadership roles in producing what we know of today as modern India. Yeah, think of Ram Mohan Roy and Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar and Rabindranath Tagore, and all these kinds of the whole 4 or 5 or 6 generations of leaders. But since I was a feminist and since I was interested in gender, I had to ask where the women were, because of course these men were all again male, right? All these leaders were men. And so I've worked a lot on what I call the mothers of the intelligentsia, because I discovered that in almost every case, I would say 90% of the cases, the responsibility for the education of the son, and therefore for the future success of the son, lay with the mother. She was the one who either made sure that the child was going to school, but very often, given the demographic patterns of that time, the mothers were widowed. The men died earlier than the women. And it was the woman who then somehow, by working at night, by taking on a job that was outside her actual role in society, managed to fund and support in every way possible the son to complete that education. So this whole group of our leaders, the intelligentsia, would not even have been there had it not been for their mothers. And whenever we say mothers, we always think of something soft. And I'm chagrined, I'm very sad to say that in the memoirs written by these men, um, Bipin Chandra Pal's memoir is a perfect example if you want to look at it. The memoir would be 300 pages long, and 3 pages would be given to their childhood. It's completely full of adulation for the woman, for the mother. And they keep saying, the memoir writer, the son, does keep saying that all the responsibility for my success goes to my mother. She's the one who made me who I was, and everyone should have a mother like hers, and so on. But since they all say it, and since it sounds so abstract, and since there's no theorization of the subject, we all think, well, that's what you say about mothers. Who doesn't love mothers? Who doesn't respect them? Of course they're saying that because that's what you say. And the Apu trilogy is a good example. The first one of that, Apu Sansar, Apu Sanshar, right? The world of Apu, it shows that kind of a process, right? The father is not there. It's the mother who is responsible for Apu's going off to the city to get an education. And that's a very telling moment, because the extent of the mother's support was such that it included letting the son go. Okay, so they could get beyond that possessiveness and that mothering and so on, as it's stereotypically understood, to actually work for the education itself. So the whole history of education in India and the whole formation of modern India is a product of women, if you want to look at it that way. And they are the ones who did it. Demographically, they were present when the men were not. They worked. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar's mother worked at night, and she kept on, I don't know, doing really, they were Brahmins. So Brahmins are often poor in the villages, very petty tasks like grinding corn and spinning thread and so on. But she made sure that she succeeded. And this goes across the board. Sayyid Ahmad Khan has always spoken very glowingly about his mother. In his case, of course, there is a negative twist to it, because he admired his mother so much that he thought that's all that women need to be. They need to be great mothers. Yeah, so there's that risk is there, that you can do the job so well that no one wants you to do anything but that job. And I want to end this little discussion of mothers by saying that much as we must respect the work they did, we must add the caveat that they might not have wanted to do it. And to show support or positive qualities for a job should include asking the question whether it's something that the do select. Do they even have a choice, or is it just thrust on them, right? Which is another whole question, with which I want to come to the next problem, which is of how women's agency is further erased. So I mentioned how it's erased in the archival record, but another way it's erased is by promoting them to the pinnacle of sainthood and even goddesshood. So they are not like live human beings anymore to be praised for their actual work today, here, now, in a place in society, but they are somehow so abstract as to be only honored and treated with qualities that and epithets that are outside normal life. So again, looking at the schools for girls in the city of Banaras, I found that almost all had been set up by widows. That was an interesting finding. And as I mentioned just now, that's one of the interesting demographic facts about India, that there have been a lot of widows. And there have been a lot of child widows at that, because they did marry very early, and some of them got widowed even before they had consummated their marriages that early. So there is a stereotype to the category widow, and we think we know the suffering they go through and the kind of role that they have to play. Well, I found a whole different world. I found that these were very active women. They had got themselves an education, got themselves training, they had taken help from all kinds of quarters, and they had set up schools. And these were girls' schools. And the intention of these schools was that girls should not suffer the same fate which they had had to suffer. So they were equipping girls to stand on their own feet. the trouble was, there's two problems here. One is that they were never acknowledged, as I just said, for being the kind of public figures that they were. They were always given the titles of being a kind of Lakshmi, the goddess Lakshmi, because they could raise so much funds for their institutions, or the goddess Durga, because they could overcome odds and defeat any kinds of obstacles in their way, or the goddess Saraswati, because they were full of learning and they promoted learning and so on. So this kind of making them into saints and goddesses, which doesn't happen for men. Men are just, themselves, and they are great leaders. As I said, they're all these nationalists in India. They're not considered gods, but the women are considered like goddesses. And that's a way of disempowering them, of taking away from them the real work they did and moving them into some ethereal realm. And the other problem is that they themselves sort of bought into this discourse. Many of their lifestyles tended to be very ascetic instead of being just normal lifestyles. And they did not play a very strong role as a role model for their own students. And here I think of my own school, Loreto, which is a school run by nuns. And these nuns, if you were to think about it, were very strong women who had opted out of their own social circles to come. They were from Ireland, they were Irish nuns, to come across the seas and work in a dangerous place like India, not lions and tigers, but a lot of different infections and problems. And they had made the choice themselves, and they were perfectly able to run very big, complicated institutions like all the Loretos in India and elsewhere in the world. So they were powerful role models, right? They had careers, they had jobs, they had lives of their own, even though they are supposedly wedded to Christ, but they knew what part that played, and they, in front of us, in front of the students and in front of the public, they were like very professional women. However, what do you think they taught the girls? They taught the girls not to wear short skirts. They taught the girls to keep their knees together when sitting and to not cross their legs in a certain way or not speak in certain ways, right? We were very definitely socialized into femininity. It's a paradox why women themselves are against their own sex, right? They do not want to share the power that they experience with others. And we know a whole lot of lore about mother-in-laws oppressing daughters-in-law, when in fact that is exactly the kind of bond that might be the turning point for young women, had it been possible. It's like make others not get empowered by providing for them facilities which were denied to us, but rather let them suffer the same way that we suffered. So if we grew up and were made to play gender roles, it has to be the same for them. Okay, so the next problem, the last one, is what we may call, I could relate it to what's called third wave feminism. If you follow the first and second wave as defined by Betty Friedan, who is the Karl Marx of feminism, if you like. So the idea here is that women have agency and they should exercise choice, and they could prefer to be housewives rather than career women, or work for the men in their kinship circles, or do whatever else they want. It's not a case of black and white, that they have false consciousness or they have an aroused consciousness. In the original book, The Feminine Mystique, Betty Friedan criticized the idea that women could find fulfillment only through child rearing and homemaking. In this next turn, what is proposed is that they could find fulfillment in child rearing and homemaking. And when Friedan hypothesizes that women are the victims of false beliefs that require them to find identity in their lives only through their husbands and children, now this is complicated, and we have to see, why should we know better than the woman herself? If she claims that she is finding a certain identity in that work, then we have to take that seriously. So I translated a novel called Mai, which is a Hindi novel. And there the main character brings this out in a very, very complete way. She is only a housewife and she is supposed to be trapped in that situation, and her children want to save her. But at the end of the novel, the author discloses how actually it's much more complicated than that. And I'm going to leave it at that. But you might also have seen the movie English Winglish, where in a different way, the main character is considered weak and repressed because she doesn't speak English, she doesn't know English, and there are, sad situations in which she is abused for being so pathetic by her husband and her daughter. And then she comes to her own, and the ending is very Bollywoodish. But the idea is that a woman could be somehow seemingly lesser, and at the same time, what we need to do is to expand our own horizons to see how she actually has a rich enough life for herself, right? We can't dominate her like men dominate her by thinking of her as necessarily in need of a particular kind of lifestyle. Other research has shown how women within their own groups and communities and networks actually have a lot of access to what we call culture. It's not high culture by the definitions of our society at present. They have different languages, different genres of performance and celebration and literature and so on. They have different even festivals and activities. They sing and laugh and dance and have their own rituals. And all this is simply not known. It's underrated, is understood, it's under-researched. Okay? It's time for me to wind up. So I'll just mention the last problem, which is also the first problem. It's the overarching problem. It's the biggest problem of all. Why is there this discrimination? Fine, we have looked at it in different ways, but where does it come from, whether in the family or in the society and so on? What's at the heart of it? And I'm not going to be able to give you the answer because it needs a lot of time to discuss it all. But, in one sense, the answer is very simple as I see it. It's the high value placed on a woman's sexuality, and more precisely her virginity. And that's what it's all about. Women cannot be free because on them depends, and on their reproductive ability depends the authenticity of the clan, right? The lineage or the bloodline. And therefore, they have to be controlled, they have to be disciplined, and one thing leads to another, and before you know it, there's a whole cage within which girlhood and womanhood is being confined. Looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. We do not have questions right now, so I'm hoping if someone wants to add them, they will. But we have two comments that I wanted to share with you. One was right at the introduction of the lecture when you made a comment about hidden curriculum, and Rituraj had resonating views about it, that how hidden curriculum does spin to the gender aspect and differential treatment of girl children, thereby shaping their schooling experiences. For example, the seating arrangement or making boys sit with girls in order to make them talk less, and it's a part of punishment that is given. So these are like small parts of hidden curriculum that also show aspects of gender. And a lot of people are asking if we will share the references, and yes, we will share recommended readings in our lecture notes. I think people want to ask questions. They're raising their hands, so I'm just going to let them speak once. Anand, you've raised your hand, right? Would you like to ask a question?
Hi. Thank you. Thank you, Nita ma'am, for this amazing lecture. I'm really sorry I joined a little late. The time just worked out in a way where I was just driving back from work and I tried to connect through my phone, and I feel like I caught a lot of it. I work in education, ma'am, in Lucknow with Study Hall Educational Foundation, and I was just wondering, while you're focusing on gender and the series also focuses on caste, I was wondering if you had any particular suggestion on particularly on integration when we are looking at problems such as gender and caste. And I will just take 1 minute to pinpoint what I'm really asking, is because I was talking to Anup sir from Nalanda Academy, and how he emphasized on how sometimes integration for the sake of integration can actually lead to more discrimination, and children, when they step out, are anyway going to be assimilate into a society where there is a lot of diversity. So maybe sometimes having these barriers and having homogeneous groups really helps. So when we're looking at these problems in educational spaces, what do you think the role of integration is, and where it helps and where it doesn't help, and where these lines are? Thank you so much.
Well, Anand, um, I hope you weren't discussing this thing seriously with whoever it is you were discussing it with. How could you even think that because the larger society has some kind of, pronounced gender divisions, that we educators in schools should play a role of funneling children into those destined roles? No, the role of schools is to partly protest against that, and of course create people who are thinking people. We have to support the individual within us. None of us is one unified kind of identity. So the gender role that we also have in our identity is only one part of us. There is, of course, class and 2, 3 other things which are similar traps, but there is the human being in us, right? Which is the same human being as in all of us. And that human being needs support from the school, from educators, to find themselves. So we have to make the class and the gender aspects and the caste and religion aspects, we have to give them their role in history and geography and politics. That's what should be the contribution of teaching these subjects: history, geography, politics, etc. That is, we can tell each student how they came to be who they are. And therefore, once you understand that, then you know that you could be something else. You could be whatever you want to be. I don't think it's a problem at all to make children think of doing things and of wanting things which is seemingly beyond them right now. This is how people have worked and done things in history. And the school, a good school, should work precisely for that, not for reproducing classes as they exist or gender roles as they exist.
It goes, I think what you just said goes interestingly with the next question. I think it connects to what you were talking about feminism and the first and the second wave of feminism too. So how far do you think the element of individual choice is important in context of taking up gendered roles and responsibilities? For example, say to be career oriented or not, to be a full-time homemaker or not, and so on. One is this. I'll put one more question. What do you think about single sex? So just not co-ed schools. Some are turning back to that as both boys and girls perform better. Yeah.
Yeah. So about the individual versus, I would presume, the community, right? So girls are socialized into being members of communities. They're supposed to be the ones who actually can hold the group, literally the family together. There's this movie, Bengali film called Paroma. If you've seen that, Paroma is a perfect depiction of this question, this issue actually. Paroma is the name of the daughter-in-law of a Bengali family, a joint family, and she is beautiful and she is a lovely person, and everyone loves her and she performs her role to perfection. So everyone has their own relationship with her, and she is the kind of hub of the wheel that holds it all together. Until one day, she meets a young man, a photographer, who just wants to take her picture of the family and all that, but a relationship develops and he challenges her to think about herself. And for the first time, she starts thinking about herself as an individual. Like, who am I? What do I want? Oh, and then she discovers what she loves and what interests her and what she wants to do, and all kinds of things open up. And at the end of it, she is disgraced in her family because she makes some choices as an individual, and even her own daughter is not able to completely digest it and turns her back on her mother. So it's a very difficult road to tread. If you want to be an individual, I think almost all of us, while wanting that, would step back and not risk losing the love and the networking of the group that we belong to, and the anticipation that everyone has from us, and how easily we can satisfy them. I mean, this is where we have to understand ourselves, each one of us. And therefore, when we are teaching as teachers or advising students, it's always on an individual basis. We are going to have to talk to students as to what it is that they want to do. Finally, the choice should be with the person concerned. And we have to be able to teach students to think for themselves. And as I said, in line with what you mentioned, third wave feminism, in fact, we have to understand that one or the other choice is not necessarily good or bad. Choices are very similar sometimes, because it's not that every individual is so perfectly fulfilled. Someone who's acting, just for themselves has a lot of power, or has a lot of authenticity, or is the right kind of person. And someone who is a housewife or working basically for the family or for others is weak on all those scores. Most men are not individuals. They are always trapped within, their work or their families themselves. They are not able to stand up or think for themselves or act for themselves or make choices. An actual agent, someone who can decide, choose, knowing all the options, and therefore stick with it and then be happy with those things, is a very rare kind of person. And it's best to know that and acknowledge that. I hope that comes close to the answers that someone were looking for. What do I think of single-sex schools? Since I have all my life gone to only a girls' school, I find them a problem. I think I was scarred for life. I think not knowing enough boys as you're growing up, not having a comfortable everyday relationship with them, is a huge problem. There are many advantages to be gained by not having that competition, as I mentioned, not having to measure yourself by the yardsticks of a society that already evaluates boys higher than girls. All that is there. So someone like me could really excel without any threat or any kind of vibe of competitiveness from a boy, with regard to everything that I was interested in, whether it's sports or debating or whatever. At the same time, I grew up thinking a boy was only someone who you fell in love with, or marrying, or was a brother, that kind of thing. It's very simplistic. This is not how society works, and it doesn't make much sense to isolate boys and girls like that. So everything taken into account, I don't think that single-sex schools are a very good idea for either sex.
Thank you. So 2 questions. There are a few more, but we could cover them in the notes later. These 2 questions, again, I say this on each lecture, but we will be closing at 7:15. We are exceeding our time. First question: what roles do schools play in equipping children to understand that gender is a fluid concept? Because ultimately we still do live in a heteronormative society where anything that goes against the norm is the person will be discriminated against, the person will be mistreated. First question. The second one is just 1 minute. How do you think we can work towards diversifying the curriculum that we have right now? Assuming that this curriculum is mostly designed by men for men, highlights the works of men, so that girls also get role models within academia. Speaking from their own experience, this is Sanchita. She's speaking from her own experience. That a lot of boys in school used to argue that women have not achieved much because their curricula mostly comprises of men.
Yeah. Okay. So both are similar. Both are about how to educate both boys and girls into a better gender consciousness, right? Gender realization. The answer to the first one is that schools are not doing much. And the answer lies partly in the last question. Most of the textbooks are devoid of any gender sensitivity. And no one is taking a proactive role in restoring the voices of women or bringing in that kind of thing which I mentioned about the possibility that they are just not being represented. What we need to do, I think, is to start at a very small level, each one in our own place, make our own plans. We can't immediately think of aiming at changing all the textbooks and all the teachers' education and so on. That should happen, but for that we would need much more of a change at the higher political echelons. And what we should work for is the next elections and voting, other kinds of people in order to have more interest in educational issues to begin with. I mean, education is a non-topic for political parties, and we can't bring about change at a national level like this. But we can, at our own personal level, at each one in their own schools or the groups of schools that we have anything to do with, and the teachers that we might influence through whatever means, some by teachers training, some by writing or whatever. We need to plan many more strategies within the classroom. I've mentioned a few to respond to that kind of a question, like the boys who raise this question about the historical inferiority of women, right? I mentioned the 4 or 5 kind of responses you could give and the kinds of materials you could produce for them, bring forth to their attention. But apart from that, in all kinds of ways, in the little things, the hidden curriculum ways, and the spatial ways, the temporal ways, we could introduce gender sensitivity and make sure that the girls in our classrooms are aided and abetted in being able to criticize and hopefully fight off the gender socialization that is part of their bigger world. And the boys likewise are made at least aware that it's not a problem only for girls. We didn't have time today for me to bring up masculinity and the production of that. It would be nice to have another lecture on that. But it's actually part of the same relationship. And there would be no girls if there were no boys. There would be no femininity if we didn't produce masculinity. And it's a burden for boys. We don't discuss it as much, and they certainly don't find themselves as aware of it because of the lack of discussion. But you can see it. You can see it in the eyes of many boys. You can see their slouching bodies carrying the burden of masculinity as they walk through the corridors of school.
Thank you so much. I think, we covered all the questions and we are within our second time limit. So, thank you so much, everyone, for joining in today. We will be sharing the lecture recordings and notes and recommended resources in the coming week.
Definitely.
You will receive an email about it. And you'll also receive details of our upcoming workshops and lectures within the next few weeks. So yes, thank you so much for joining in today, and we hope to see you the next time as well.
Thank you.